Imagine tens of thousands of peasants leaving their homes with nothing but faith in their hearts and crude weapons in their hands. They believed they were marching to liberate the holiest city in the world. Behind them followed powerful knights, men of steel and ambition, ready to carve their names into history. What began as a call to rescue Jerusalem would erupt into massacres, epic battles, and the birth of new kingdoms in foreign lands. Before we dive into the battles, betrayals, and bloodshed of the First Crusade, I'd like to ask you for one quick favor. If you enjoy exploring history's most shocking and forgotten stories, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way you'll never miss the next epic chapter of the past. Now, let's journey back to the year 1096, when the People's Crusade set the stage for one of the most dramatic wars in history. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, did not emerge in isolation, but was the product of deep transformations in the medieval world. In the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks rose to power in the Islamic East, sweeping across Persia and into Anatolia. Their decisive victory over the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 left Asia Minor largely under Turkish control, only shadows melting into darkness, fracturing the Byzantine frontier and weakening imperial authority. The once mighty Byzantine Empire, long considered the bulwark of Christendom in the East, now faced the imminent threat of collapse. In desperation, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos appealed to the West for military aid, a request that would spark one of the most dramatic episodes in medieval history. At the same time, Western Europe was undergoing its own transformations. The feudal system produced a warrior aristocracy in constant search of land, wealth, and status. The papacy, seeking to expand its spiritual and political authority, found an opportunity in responding to Byzantium's plea. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II issued a call to arms, urging Christian knights and commoners alike to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. His speech electrified audiences by combining religious fervor with promises of earthly and eternal rewards. For the devout, participation in the crusade offered the remission of sins and the assurance of salvation. For ambitious nobles, it promised land, glory, and new opportunities in the East. Religious motives were paramount. Jerusalem, the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, was viewed as the ultimate prize for Christendom. Yet the crusade cannot be reduced to piety alone. Political calculations were equally critical. The Pope sought to assert leadership over Christendom, while European knights sought to channel their violent energies away from internecine wars at home. Economic motives also played a role. Merchants from Italian city-states, like Venice and Genoa, saw the chance to expand trade routes into the Eastern Mediterranean, while poorer knights and peasants sought material relief in the promise of conquered lands. Thus, the First Crusade was born out of a convergence of crises and ambitions: Byzantine desperation, papal opportunism, and the intertwined religious, political, and economic aspirations of medieval Europe. It marked the beginning of 2 centuries of holy wars that would reshape both East and West. The People's Crusade, 1096, when Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem at Clermont in November 1095. His words ignited not only the knightly classes of Europe, but also the imaginations of ordinary men and women. While the formal crusade under noble leadership took months to organize, a wave of popular enthusiasm surged almost immediately. Known as the People's Crusade, this movement was less disciplined, poorly equipped, and tragically doomed. Yet it reveals the extraordinary power of religious zeal and desperation in medieval society. Preachers and inspiration. Peter the Hermit's role, central to the People's Crusade, was the charismatic preacher Peter the Hermit. A small, gaunt, and ascetic figure, Peter claimed to have received a divine vision of Christ, commanding him to lead the faithful eastward. Riding on a donkey, barefoot, and in humble garb, he traveled through France and the Rhineland, captivating crowds with impassioned sermons. Chroniclers like Albert of Aachen describe how men and women were swept up by his words, abandoning homes, farms, and families, in the belief that God had chosen them to reclaim the Holy Sepulchre. For peasants who lived lives of hardship, the message was electrifying. The promise of salvation, coupled with the possibility of escaping poverty and serfdom, made the crusade appear as both a spiritual duty and a social opportunity. Something. Unlike knights who carefully planned their expeditions, these peasants acted impulsively. By spring 1096, tens of thousands, including farmers, artisans, women, and even children, began streaming eastward, armed with little more than farm tools, makeshift weapons, and boundless conviction. Pogroms in the Rhineland, religious fervor, however, often twisted into violence. Many crusaders viewed the expedition as a broader war against all perceived enemies of Christ. This sentiment found its most horrific expression in the Rhineland massacres, or pogroms, against Jewish communities. As groups of crusaders passed through the cities of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, they turned their zeal into persecution of Jews, accusing them of being Christ killers and obstacles to God's plan. Led by figures like Count Emicho of Flonheim, mobs stormed Jewish quarters, killing men, women, and children. Despite attempts by some local bishops to protect the Jews, Bishop Johann of Speyer reportedly sheltered many in his palace. Violence often overwhelmed such efforts. Estimates suggest thousands of Jews were murdered in these pogroms. For Jewish chroniclers like Solomon Bar Simpson, these massacres represented a devastating rupture, showing how apocalyptic Christian fervor could explode into indiscriminate brutality. The Rhineland massacres remain one of the darkest legacies of the People's Crusade, illustrating the dangers of religious extremism when combined with social unrest. The journey through Central Europe. After gathering in various contingents across France and Germany, the disparate bands of Crusaders began the long trek toward Constantinople. Their numbers may have reached 40,000, though many were non-combatants. The journey exposed both their disorganization and their dependence on local goodwill. As the Crusaders passed through Hungary and the Balkans, tensions flared with local populations. Supplies quickly ran out, leading to looting, violence, and reprisals. In Hungary, King Coleman tried to maintain order, but several clashes erupted when Crusaders resorted to theft. Further south, in Bulgaria and the Byzantine territories, the undisciplined mob caused even more destruction, plundering villages and straining the already delicate relationship between Byzantines and Westerners. By the time the Crusaders staggered into Constantinople in the summer of 1096, their reputation preceded them. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who had originally requested disciplined knights from the west, was appalled by the rabble that arrived. He provided them with food and transport across the Bosporus into Anatolia, but was eager to move them along, fearing they would destabilize his capital. In Anatolia, a march to disaster. Once in Anatolia, the People's Crusade confronted the harsh realities of warfare against the Seljuk Turks, ill-equipped, poorly organized, and lacking military leadership. The Crusaders were easy prey for seasoned Turkish forces. Initially, the Crusaders engaged in raids around Nicaea, the Seljuk capital in western Anatolia. They managed some small victories against local garrisons, which only emboldened them. However, they were divided into factions, one led by Peter the Hermit, another by German and Italian groups, and coordination was almost non-existent. Peter himself eventually returned to Constantinople to seek supplies and guidance, leaving the Crusaders vulnerable. The Seljuk commander, Kilij Arslan I, initially dismissive of the peasant host, soon recognized their potential to disrupt his lands and moved swiftly to crush them. In October 1096, the Crusaders were lured into an ambush near Civitat, modern-day Izmit. The Seljuks attacked with cavalry, showering the Crusaders with arrows and cutting them down in droves. Untrained peasants stood little chance against mounted archers. Some fought desperately, others fled to the coast, where Byzantine ships rescued a few survivors, but the majority were slaughtered. Estimates suggest perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 perished in this catastrophe. The People's Crusade ended almost as suddenly as it had begun, with only a handful surviving to join the later, more organized Crusader armies. Significance and legacy. Though militarily a failure, the People's Crusade had profound symbolic and historical significance. It demonstrated the extraordinary mobilizing power of Pope Urban's call, which reached far beyond the knightly elite he had originally targeted. The participation of peasants, artisans, and women highlighted the depth of religious devotion and the desperation of lower social classes seeking change. The Rhineland pogroms foreshadowed darker undercurrents of the crusading movement, where piety often coexisted with intolerance and violence against religious minorities. For Jewish communities, the massacres were remembered as acts of martyrdom and persecution, shaping Jewish-Christian relations for centuries. For the Byzantines, the People's Crusade was both a nuisance and a warning. Alexios I learned firsthand the dangers of unleashing uncontrolled Western mobs into his territory, which deepened mistrust between East and West even before the knightly armies of the First Crusade arrived. Most importantly, the annihilation at Civitate underscored the need for discipline, leadership, and military skill. When the official Crusader armies arrived later in 2096 under leaders like Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond of Toulouse, their campaign was shaped by the lessons of the People's Crusade. Unlike the peasant bands, the knights were more strategic, better supplied, and capable of defeating Seljuk forces in set battles. Conclusion: the People's Crusade stands as both an inspiring and tragic episode in medieval history. It captured the raw faith and longing of ordinary people, but also revealed the dangers of unbridled zeal. While it failed utterly in its military objectives, its memory lingered as a testament to the power of religious conviction and as a grim reminder of the chaos and bloodshed that often accompanied it. In many ways, the People's Crusade was a prelude to the grand drama of the First Crusade, foreshadowing both its soaring ideals and its violent realities. The Knights' Crusade, 1096 to 1099. The failure of the People's Crusade might have disheartened some, but for the great lords of Europe, Pope Urban II's call was still a sacred mission. Unlike the ill-equipped peasants who rushed eastward, the knightly contingents that followed were organized, supplied, and led by seasoned commanders. Their march, though grueling, would prove decisive, forging the path that culminated in the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. Leaders and armies. Between late 1096 and early 1097, the professional crusading armies began to assemble. They came not as one unified host, but as separate contingents, each under the command of a prominent noble. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, known for his piety and steadfastness. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer from southern Italy, ambitious and cunning. Raymond IV of Toulouse, the wealthiest of the leaders, deeply religious, but also fiercely independent. Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France, though his contingent was relatively small. Robert of Flanders, Robert of Normandy, and Stephen of Blois, prominent nobles who brought additional troops and prestige. Each leader commanded a semi-independent force, but together they represented the military elite of Western Christendom. by the spring of 1097, tens of thousands of knights, infantry, and non-combatants converged on Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, welcomed them cautiously. The debacle of the People's Crusade was fresh in his mind, and he sought to ensure these armies would serve imperial interests. Alexios required each leader to swear an oath of loyalty and to promise that captured lands, once part of the Byzantine Empire, would be returned to him. Though the Crusader lords agreed reluctantly, the oaths planted seeds of tension that would later shape Byzantine-Latin relations. The Siege of Nicaea, May-June 1097. The first major target was Nicaea, capital of the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan I. Learning from the fate of the peasants, the Crusaders marched in coordination with Byzantine forces. The siege began in May 1097, with the Crusaders surrounding the city by land, while Byzantine ships blockaded the lake on which it sat. Kilij Arslan, underestimating the Crusaders, had initially gone east to fight rivals. On hearing of the siege, he rushed back, but was decisively defeated in battle outside the city. The Crusaders pressed the siege with determination, but the Byzantines cleverly negotiated a secret surrender with the defenders. On June 18, 1097, the gates of Nicaea were opened, not to the Crusaders, but to Byzantine troops who raised the imperial banner. This maneuver frustrated the Crusaders, who had hoped to plunder the city. Alexios, however, supplied them with food, gold, and gifts, smoothing tensions for the moment. The fall of Nicaea boosted morale and marked the beginning of a cooperative, if uneasy, campaign. The Battle of Dorylaeum, July 1097. After Nicaea, the Crusaders pressed deeper into Anatolia. On July 1st, 1097, near Dorylaeum, their vanguard under Bohemond and Robert of Normandy was suddenly ambushed by Kilij Arslan's Seljuk cavalry. The Turks attacked with classic hit-and-run tactics, surrounding the Crusader camp and showering it with arrows. Panic spread among the civilians and non-combatants, who sought shelter behind wagons. Bohemond urged his knights to hold firm, forming defensive lines around the camp. For hours, the Crusaders endured relentless assaults, their armor protecting them, but their horses suffering under volleys of arrows. Just as defeat seemed imminent, the rear contingent under Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Hugh of Vermandois arrived. The combined charge of heavy cavalry shattered the Turkish lines. The victory at Dorylaeum was crucial. It proved that disciplined Crusader forces could withstand and defeat the feared Turkish cavalry. The psychological impact was immense. The Crusaders gained confidence, while Kilij Arslan retreated east, abandoning western Anatolia to the invaders. The march across Anatolia. Though victorious, the march across Anatolia tested the Crusaders to their limits. The summer heat was brutal, and water was scarce. Chroniclers describe nights collapsing from thirst and animals dying by the roadside. Hunger became a constant companion. The army survived on meager rations, often resorting to eating roots, leaves, or the flesh of their horses. Disease spread rapidly through the weakened host, claiming lives daily. Yet the Crusaders pressed on, driven by faith and the dream of Jerusalem. Byzantine guides attempted to keep them supplied, but the sheer size of the army made provisioning difficult. The journey through Anatolia left the Crusaders exhausted but hardened, a prelude to even greater trials ahead. The Siege of Antioch, October 1097 to June 1098. Perhaps the most dramatic episode of the First Crusade was the Siege of Antioch, a massive fortified city controlling the route to Syria. The Crusaders reached its walls in October 1097 and immediately began a blockade. The siege lasted more than 7 months, straining the Crusaders' endurance to breaking point. Food supplies dwindled, forcing them to eat horses, stray animals, and even leather. Starvation and disease claimed thousands. Desertion became common. Even Stephen of Blois abandoned the cause, returning to Europe in disgrace. The besiegers themselves were besieged when a large Muslim relief army under Kerboga of Mosul arrived in June 1098. Trapped between the city's defenders and Kerboga's forces, the Crusaders seemed doomed. Their salvation came through betrayal. A local Armenian convert to Islam, Firuz, who commanded one of Antioch's towers, secretly offered to admit the Crusaders. On the night of June 2nd to 3rd, 1098, Bohemond led a small group into the city through Firuz's tower. By dawn, the Crusaders had seized Antioch, massacring many of its inhabitants. Yet their ordeal was not over. Kerboga's army now surrounded the Crusaders within Antioch's walls. Morale sank, and despair threatened to undo them. At this desperate moment, a supposed miracle occurred. A Provençal priest, Peter Bartholomew, claimed to have discovered the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side. The relic inspired renewed faith. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders sallied forth, carrying the Holy Lance before them. Against the odds, they defeated Kerboga's larger army. The victory was attributed to divine intervention. Legacy of the Knights' Crusade. The capture of Antioch marked a turning point. The Crusaders had endured famine, disease, treachery, and overwhelming odds, yet emerged victorious. Their successes, Nicaea, Dorylaeum, and Antioch, demonstrated not only the effectiveness of European heavy cavalry, but also the sustaining power of faith in the face of adversity. Internal rivalries, however, also became evident. Bohemond, claiming Antioch as his prize, refused to hand it over to the Byzantines, breaking his oath to Alexios. This deepened mistrust between Crusaders and Byzantines, foreshadowing future conflicts. By 1098, the Crusader host was reduced in number, but hardened in spirit. Though exhausted, they pressed onward, their eyes fixed on the ultimate goal, Jerusalem. Conclusion. The Knights' Crusade transformed the crusading movement from a disorganized peasant pilgrimage into a formidable military enterprise. Led by ambitious nobles, sustained by Byzantine diplomacy, and tested by the hardships of Anatolia, the Crusaders carved a path through adversity. The victories at Nicaea and Dorylaeum proved their martial prowess, while the long ordeal at Antioch revealed both their vulnerability and their capacity for endurance. By the summer of 1098, they had proven themselves not merely as pilgrims, but as conquerors. Bound by faith and fire, their journey was far from over, but the foundations had been laid for the dramatic climax, the capture of Jerusalem. The capture of Jerusalem, 1099. By the spring of 1099, nearly 3 years after setting out from Europe, the Crusaders finally turned their gaze toward their ultimate goal, Jerusalem. Hardened by battles at Nicaea, Dorylaeum, and Antioch, the surviving army had been whittled down by hunger, disease, and desertion. Yet what remained was a core of determined knights and infantry, bound by a conviction that God had chosen them to reclaim the city of Christ's passion and resurrection. Their approach to Jerusalem marked the climactic chapter of the First Crusade, the march south through Palestine. After consolidating their gains in Antioch, the Crusaders began their march south in early 1099. Their journey through Syria and Palestine was marked by both hardship and unexpected assistance. Starvation remained a constant threat. In the arid landscapes of Palestine, food and water were scarce. Chroniclers recount how soldiers grew faint from thirst, forcing the army to rely on whatever supplies they could seize from local villages or secure through fragile truces. Despite this, the Crusaders also benefited from alliances. The Fatimid Caliphate, rivals of the Seljuk Turks, had recently taken control of Jerusalem, 1098. At times, local Arab rulers, fearful of Seljuk power, offered the Crusaders food or safe passage. Still, progress was slow and arduous. By early June 1099, the Siege of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, perched on rocky hills and fortified with strong walls, posed a daunting challenge. The Crusaders lacked proper siege equipment, and the surrounding countryside offered little wood. At first, they attempted to blockade the city, hoping to starve it into submission. But the Fatimid garrison, commanded by Iftikhar al-Dawla, was well provisioned and prepared for a long defense. Realizing that starvation alone would not bring victory, the Crusaders began constructing siege towers, ladders, and battering rams. Timber was scarce, so wood was hauled from distant forests or dismantled from villages, and even ships transported overland from Jaffa. The logistical effort was immense, and morale wavered under the relentless summer heat. In mid-June, a solemn religious procession revived the Crusaders' spirits. Following the model of biblical Jericho, barefoot priests and warriors circled the city walls, praying and singing psalms. Chroniclers record that this ritual was seen as a sign of divine favor. By early July, 2 massive siege towers had been built. Godfrey of Bouillon positioned one against the northern wall, while Raymond of Toulouse directed another against the southern defenses near Mount Zion. The defenders countered fiercely, hurling stones, flaming torches, and boiling oil. Yet the Crusaders persisted, shielding their towers with hides soaked in vinegar to resist fire. July 15th, 1099, breaking the walls. The final assault began on July 14th. For hours, arrows and stones filled the air as the towers inched toward the walls. The Fatimid defenders fought with desperation, setting one tower ablaze and repelling multiple attempts at scaling ladders. But on the morning of July 15th, Godfrey's tower reached the walls near the northeast corner of the city. As the defenders concentrated their efforts elsewhere, Crusader knights dropped a drawbridge from the tower onto the battlements. Godfrey himself is said to have been among the first across, leading a vanguard of knights who carved out a foothold. Behind them, more Crusaders poured through, overwhelming the defenders. Simultaneously, other groups breached gates from the south. By midday, Jerusalem had fallen. After years of peril and suffering, the Crusaders stood within the Holy City. Their triumph, however, would be remembered as one of the bloodiest episodes of the medieval age. The massacre of Muslims and Jews. The capture of Jerusalem unleashed an orgy of violence. Fueled by years of hardship and religious zeal, the Crusaders showed little mercy. Chroniclers from both Christian and Muslim perspectives describe streets running with blood. Muslims who sought refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque were slaughtered. Others were cut down in their homes or while fleeing. The city's Jewish population fared no better. Many had taken shelter in synagogues, which were burned with entire congregations inside. The massacre shocked even some contemporaries. The chronicler Raymond of Toulouse justified it as divine vengeance, while the Muslim historian Ibn al-Qalanisi recorded the horror from the perspective of survivors. Estimates vary, but thousands of inhabitants, Muslims and Jews alike, were killed. For the Crusaders, this brutality was seen not as excess, but as part of God's will. In their eyes, Jerusalem had been cleansed of unbelievers, restored as religious fervor and divine providence. Once the bloodshed subsided, the Crusaders turned to solemn acts of devotion. Barefoot and weeping, knights and commoners alike processed to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ was believed to have been buried and resurrected. For many, this moment justified every sacrifice of the long journey. The hunger, the battles, the deaths of comrades. Chroniclers emphasize the sense of awe and fulfillment that pervaded the army. The victory was interpreted as clear proof of divine providence. The discovery of the Holy Lance at Antioch had already reinforced the belief that God guided the Crusaders. The fall of Jerusalem cemented it. Leaders like Godfrey of Bouillon refused royal titles within the city, preferring to be called Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, emphasizing humility before God. Conclusion: the capture of Jerusalem on July 15th, 1099, was the crowning achievement of the First Crusade. It represented not only a military triumph, but also the fulfillment of a spiritual mission that had begun with Pope Urban II's call at Clermont 4 years earlier. Yet it came at a terrible cost. The massacre of Muslims and Jews left a legacy of bitterness and enmity that would fuel centuries of conflict between Christians and the Islamic world. For medieval Europe, however, the victory was nothing less than miraculous. Against overwhelming odds, an army of knights and pilgrims had marched across continents, endured famine and disease, defeated powerful enemies, and seized the holiest city of Christendom. In their eyes, Jerusalem had been restored to its rightful place under Christian rule, a testament to their faith, courage, and above all, God's providence. The Crusaders' triumph was the birth of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, a fragile Christian state planted in the heart of the Islamic world. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the Crusades, one marked by continued warfare, cultural encounters, and enduring legacies of faith and conflict. Aftermath: the Crusader States. The capture of Jerusalem in July 1099 marked the climax of the First Crusade, but it was only the beginning of Latin Christian rule in the Levant. The victors, having seized one of the most sacred cities of Christendom, now faced the challenge of governing their conquests and securing them against powerful Muslim neighbors. From these efforts emerged the Crusader States, a network of Latin principalities that reshaped the political and cultural landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Crusader States established. 4 principal states were carved out between 1098 and 1109. The County of Edessa, 1098, the first to be founded, established by Baldwin of Bouillon after being adopted as heir by the local ruler, Thoros. Located on the frontier with Muslim powers, Edessa was isolated and vulnerable, but it set the precedent for Latin lordships in the east. The Principality of Antioch, 1098, claimed by Bohemond of Taranto after his role in seizing the city. Despite his oath to the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, Bohemond refused to return Antioch to imperial control, souring relations between Byzantium and the Crusaders. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, 1099, the crown jewel of the Crusaders' efforts. Godfrey of Bouillon refused the title of king, preferring to be styled Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. But his successors soon assumed full royal status. Jerusalem became the spiritual and political center of Latin Christendom in the Levant. The Crusader States established the County of Tripoli, 1109, founded after a protracted siege of the city, largely orchestrated by Raymond of Toulouse and his heirs. Together, these territories formed a fragile chain of Christian enclaves, stretching along the Levantine coast and into northern Syria. Feudal organization and relations. The Crusader States adopted a feudal structure modeled on Western Europe. Lords held castles and estates, owed military service to their rulers, and exercised authority over both Latin settlers and indigenous populations. Relations with the Byzantines were uneasy at best. While some crusaders acknowledged the emperor's claims, others, like Bohemond, openly defied him. This mistrust deepened the East-West divide that had already surfaced during the campaign. Interactions with Muslims were equally complex. While warfare was constant, truces and alliances were sometimes struck with local emirs, reflecting the pragmatic realities of survival in a hostile environment. For the local Christian populations, Greeks, Armenians, Syriacs, and Maronites, Latin rule was mixed. Some welcomed protection from Muslim overlords, while others resented Latin dominance and the imposition of Western ecclesiastical structures. Long-term consequences. The creation of the Crusader States had far-reaching consequences. Militarily, they became Christian strongholds in the East, but also magnets for future conflicts. Their vulnerability and isolation guaranteed that they would require continual reinforcements from Europe. This dependency was one of the chief drivers of subsequent crusading movements. The fall of Edessa in 1144, for instance, directly prompted the Second Crusade. Religiously, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem symbolized the triumph of the cross and became a destination for pilgrims across Europe. Yet the brutality of its conquest, especially the massacres in Jerusalem, left deep scars in Muslim and Jewish memory, fueling hostility and calls for jihad. Politically, the states were never fully secure. They were surrounded by powerful Muslim neighbors, Egypt to the south, Seljuk and other Turkish emirates to the north and east, and relied heavily on maritime support from Italian city-states like Guy and Venice. Their existence also worsened tensions with Byzantium, which saw them as both allies and rivals. In the longer view, the Crusader states represented the permanent militarization of faith in the Eastern Mediterranean. They stood as outposts of Latin Christendom for nearly 2 centuries, shaping cross-cultural interactions, trade, and warfare. But their fragility ensured that they remained at the heart of renewed crusading efforts until their eventual fall. Culminating conclusion. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, remains one of the most remarkable and paradoxical episodes in medieval history. For the Crusaders, its outcome was nothing short of miraculous. Against overwhelming odds, a diverse host of Western knights and pilgrims had marched across thousands of miles, endured famine, disease, and desertion, and yet triumphed in battle after battle. The capture of Jerusalem in July 1099 seemed to them a clear sign of divine favor. the fulfillment of Pope Urban II's vision at Clermont. From their perspective, it was a resounding success. Christ's city had been reclaimed, holy sites restored to Christian worship, and new Latin principalities established in the East. Yet the same events were remembered very differently by others. For the Jews of the Rhineland, the Crusade brought pogroms of shocking brutality, leaving entire communities destroyed. For Muslims and Jews in Jerusalem, what Crusaders celebrated as purification and providence, others experienced as devastation and loss. The contrasting memories of triumph and tragedy shaped interreligious relations for centuries, embedding mistrust and bitterness into the fabric of the medieval world. The First Crusade also reshaped East-West relations. On the one hand, it created enduring connections between Europe and the Levant through trade, pilgrimage, and political alliances. On the other, it deepened tensions. The Byzantines, who had initially sought aid, found themselves alienated by Latin ambition and betrayal, particularly at Antioch. Muslims, who had once dismissed the Crusaders as temporary raiders, began to rally around the idea of jihad in response to the Latin presence. The crusading movement itself became institutionalized, with future popes invoking Jerusalem and the memory of 1099 to call for new campaigns. In the end, the First Crusade was both a triumph and a tragedy, an extraordinary demonstration of medieval faith and endurance, but also a catalyst for cycles of conflict and intolerance. Its legacy was the creation of a fragile Latin Christian presence in the East and the opening of a new chapter in Christian, Jewish, and Muslim history, one defined by both cultural encounters and enduring wars of faith. The First Crusade changed the world, but the Second Crusade is even more dramatic. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter.